In this video, we're going to be replacing the front strut on this 2005 Honda Element. To remove our wheel, it's going to be a 19mm socket. I'll take our wheel off now. So our backing plate here is pretty well rusted and corroded. We're just going to make it go away. We're going to remove our caliper. We have two bolts, top and bottom. They're going to be 14mm. At this point, when we have both of these bolts broken free, we're going to make sure we have some kind of hanger ready to hang our caliper on to keep stress off of the brake line or the brake hose. Sometimes these calipers will come right off the brakes. Sometimes you'll need to get in here and pry them off. This one slid off no problem. So what we can do is take our hanger, swing it around here, and we're going to hang it right on the spring, up and out of the way. Now we can see our pads. I'm going to remove our spring hardware. Just squeeze and remove. And our pads. Our pads should pop straight out. Same thing on this side. Now to remove our caliper, we have two bolts on the back. They're going to be 17mm. We did switch over to our breaker bar because these are going to be heavily torqued in. Now at this point we can remove our caliper bracket and set that aside. So now the only thing holding our rotor in place would typically be two screws, Phillips screws. We have one missing. We do have one still here. We're going to use an impact driver here to try and break that screw free. Just going to see if it will turn by itself, and it won't. So as you hit this, it's going to turn that Phillips screw, hopefully breaking it free. There we go. We can set that screw aside. Now that the Phillips screw's out, our rotor usually comes off just like this. Sometimes you might need to hit it from the back or the front with a rubber mallet to break it free, but this one's free. So go ahead and take this right off. Our tie rod, we're going to start by taking off our cotter pin. Just going to push it back and push it back and out through. And we will not be reusing this. Okay, and our nut here is going to be a 19mm. We're going to try an impact, see if we can shock that out. There we go. So now that we have our nut removed, we're looking to remove this, our tie rod end. We're going to have to knock it up and out of our strut bracket here. So we're just going to use a hammer. And we can now swing this out of the way. So now our two strut bolts holding it to the knuckle on the bottom here, It's going to be a 19 on the actual bolt head and a 22 on the nut on the back side. So we're going to use an impact on the nut. And on the bottom. I'm going to leave those 2 bolts in. What we're going to work on now is everything else attached to the strut assembly, which is going to be our speed sensor harness and our brake harness or our brake cable attachment point here. So now on our brake line here, we have a bracket. Our bracket, you can see, is somewhat bent. This bolt did not want to move. So because we took our tie rod out, the entire strut, this entire assembly started to rotate. While we were putting force on this bolt to get it to loosen up, we actually put our tie rod back in so that this whole assembly would not rotate while we were trying to remove this bolt. So we actually got that bolt to move just a little bit, and now we're back on camera here. We'll continue to take this bolt out without the tie rod in because it now moves. We're going to remove our 12 mil bolt here holding on our brake hose to our strut. There's our bolt. All right. Now from here, we're going to actually take our caliper and just spin it over to this side. And our ABS speed sensor clip actually came out for us. There's one of the 2 that we need to remove. The other one is straight around the back. So we would have used some panel tool pliers here to pull this out. That's what we're going to use in the back. Just going to squeeze that and pull that plug right out. Now that this is out of the way and your brake is out of the way, your caliper and your brake hose is out of the way, we're actually going to take our caliper, move it a little further out of the way so we only have to worry about this here. So we're going to take this and we're going to hang it right here for right now. Actually, a better spot is probably hang it right here. Okay, so now we're going to leave one bolt in here. We're going to take our bottom bolt out. I usually just like to leave the one that's stuck in. Usually out of the 2, one of them's loose, one of them's not. This one right now is taking all the pressure and all the weight. That's why this one's kind of stuck in there. So I'll take the easier one out. I'm going to leave this in here just so everything doesn't fall apart and open up when we remove our bolts on top. Now we're up top. We have 1, 2, 3 14 millimeter nuts that we're going to need to take off on the top of our strut. As soon as we take these off, our strut will be loose and probably drop downwards, which is why we left the 1 bolt in down below. Go ahead and remove these now. All right, so you can see our strut is free and loose. Now we can go underneath and remove it from the vehicle. So now that our top 3 bolts are loose, we can come back down here and remove this 1 bolt, basically holding our strut in position. While we remove this, you want to be careful not to let it drop down and damage your CV axle boot here. So we're going to be very careful while doing this. Actually going to use the back of a hammer here and just pry up a little bit to relieve some of that pressure. There we go. So now when we release, now from here, I have a little bit of upwards pressure holding our strut up. We're going to get in behind our knuckle with the pry bar. We're going to pry our knuckle forward and our strut rearward. Like that. Separate the 2. Now you want to be very careful pulling your knuckle forward with your CV axle shaft attached. You do not want to separate the back of your axle shaft by pulling them apart. All right, so we're going to push that backwards just enough to clear our strut. Now we have speed sensor cable over here, really nothing over here. So we're going to try and take our strut out in the rear of this area here. So we're going to just work our strut out of position and out of the vehicle. Like so. From here, we're going to put our strut in and up to the top here. So we're going to try and align our top 3 bolts first. All right, so we've got 2 out of 3. What I'm going to do here is just put a nut on there by maybe a couple of threads so these 2 don't fall out. And then we'll have to work on angling our strut to get it to sit up into there. All right, so we've worked just by positioning our strut a little bit differently and twisting it and tilting it. We've got our 3rd bolt to come through, or our 3rd stud to come through. So we'll just put our nuts on there and tighten those down by hand. Now from here, what we're going to do is go underneath, put a little upward pressure on the entire suspension assembly. All right, so now if you need to twist your strut assembly to get it to line up with your knuckle, now's the time to do that. And you can see our bolt holes are not aligned. What we're looking for is to make sure that our knuckle goes into here. So now what we're going to do is align our bolts. Now that we have our knuckle into our strut, push and align our bolts here. We're going to pull this back so we can stop our bolt coming through. There we go. I'll put our nut on. I'm just going to snug this up. And now we can put our top bolt in. Sometimes you have to push and pull to align the holes here. Whoops, a little bit too much pull. We're just using a pry bar on one side to kind of help us align the holes. And thread on our nut. Now from here, what we can do is put our tie rod end in place. I'm gonna have to turn the strut slightly and push our tie rod end in place there. Okay, now we can put on our nylon lock nut for our ball joint. And again, that's just finger tight just to hold our ball joint in place. Because what's gonna happen when we start to tighten these things down is this assembly might want to twist. This tie rod end here is going to stop that from happening. So we'll come back when everything's under load and we'll tighten everything up. Now with our suspension under load, we're going to tighten down our top 3 bolts here. We're going to tighten them down to 32 foot-pounds. All right, these are going to be 15 millimeters. We're going to tighten it down. We're actually going to torque it down to 32 foot-pounds. Now with our suspension under load, we're going to tighten down our 2 strut to knuckle bolts. It's going to be a 19 on one side, a 22 on the other. We're going to torque them down to 116 foot-pounds. Now we can torque our tie rod end down to 32 foot-pounds. All right, and now we can release pressure on our suspension, lower that control arm and floor jack. And before we put our old strut into the recycling bin, this bracket here that was holding our speed sensor cabling, we're going to take that bracket and bolt off and reuse it on the new one. It's going to be a 10 millimeter. All right, that's the part and the bolt we're looking for. So now we're going to take our bracket and put it on our new strut. And now, while we're here, we can take our speed sensor cable, clip it into the bracket in the back, just push right in, and our forward clip here is just going to push right in as well. So our clip just broke. The bottom was already broken, and the top, we tried to just open it up a touch more so it would stay in. Definitely just broke even further. So what we're going to do, we'll probably revisit this, but for right now, to hold it in place and out of our way, is we're going to put a zip tie around this and around the bracket. What this will allow us to do is keep moving and hold this in position until we're ready to revisit this clip here. And we'll trim that zip tie. And now, we're going to move on to our brakes. Our caliper, we hung down low out of our way, and we're going to take it, we're going to flip it over, and we're going to hang it on our new strut. Now we can take our brake line here and reattach. All right, so now we can take our brake hose bracket and put that in place. And that's going to be a 12 millimeter bolt. Now what I'm actually noticing here is that the speed sensor is, this wire is run incorrectly here. If you take your caliper, put it into position, it's going to put more strain on both cables. All right? So what we're going to do is rerun our speed sensor outside here. So now at this point, we're going to want to make sure that this hub surface is nice and clean and ready to receive the back of our rotor. This is actually very clean, but if yours needed a little bit more attention and it had some corrosion on there, you can get in there with a wire brush and clean up whatever you need to. If you need to use an air tool or lightly sand off some really heavy corrosion, you can do that. Ours just has some nasty grease and oil built up on here. We're going to hit it with some brake clean. Just give it a quick little dry, because what we're going to do from here is hit it with some anti-seize. We'll let that flash off for a minute and we'll come back with some anti-seize spray. So now we're going to use some anti-seize, but we're going to use it in an aerosol form. So instead of spraying everything in the general area, we're just going to use our paper towel here just to stop it from getting where it doesn't need to be. We're just going to put a light coat on our hub surface. We're going to line up our Phillips screw holes. We're going to put it in place. And for this vehicle specifically, we only had one Phillips screw in our old rotor, so we're going to replace the one screw. So we're going to push our rotor in nice and tight. We're going to pick one of the two and put our Phillips screw in. I'm going to hold the rotor in place and we're going to tighten that down. Now we can take our caliper bracket and put it onto our knuckle, put our 2 bolts in. And again, these are going to be 17 millimeters. We're just going to snug these up, and we're going to come back and torque them down. So now we're going to torque our caliper bolts down to 79 foot-pounds. Now that our caliper bracket is torqued down, we can install our brake pads. We're just going to simply put the bottom tab into the metal slot, push down, and align the top and push into the rotor. Now that you have your pads in and squeeze nice and tight to the rotor, we have 2 last pieces of hardware. They're going to be these spring clips. There are holes on your brake pads. You're just going to squeeze these together and put them in the holes. Sometimes these want to fly out, so watch your eyes and be careful that they might want to run around the room. Okay, now our caliper has a piston inside that squeezes our brake pads. Our brake pads were a little thinner, they were used, so the piston is set out far enough where it needed to make contact. Our new pads are a little thicker, so we're going to have to push this piston back just a little bit more. We're going to use this compression tool to do that. You can use a C-clamp with a couple old pads or an old pad. The idea here is just to push this piston back into this area here as flat as possible, not at an angle. Now that we have our piston pushed back, we can release our tool. And now we can take our caliper, put it on our pads. I'm going to take it off of the hanger. Again, we're going to be careful not to stress the brake hose. Slide it onto our pads and into position for our bolts on the pins. Once it's in position, take one of the 2 bolts and thread it in place to hold our caliper. So with our 2 caliper bolts now snugged up by hand, you want to make sure on the bottom here, your caliper pins, the pieces that we greased earlier, you want to make sure they align with the caliper. There's a slot that those pins will sit into, which will stop the pin from spinning when you tighten these down. I'll make sure that's aligned. If it's misaligned, you may also not be able to get your bolt in. So we've got those both aligned, top and bottom. And now, with our 14 millimeter socket, we can tighten these down to 25 foot-pounds. Now that we have our caliper installed, we had to press back our piston, which means now we're going to have to pump our brakes and bleed our brake line. We want to make sure we didn't introduce any air or anything into that line. Typically when you do this, you won't introduce any air because you haven't opened a line, but you have moved fluid far enough back where you want to make sure it's all the way forward and ready to go when you start and drive your vehicle. So to do this, we're going to use a 10mm socket. We're going to open up our bleeder screw. We're going to wait for some fluid to come out. We're going to look for no hesitation, no break, and no air bubbles in that line. Once we get that, we can close this back up, go up top of the vehicle, check our brake fluid level. We want to make sure that it's full to where it needs to be. And if we need to add any, we'll go ahead and do that. So now, with a 10mm, we'll open this up. We'll check our fluid, make sure here we're not getting any breaks or air bubbles in the line. Looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and close it up and tighten it down. And again, once you're done with this step, you're going to want to go up top, check your brake fluid level, and if you're low, go ahead and add some. And one thing I like to do now that you've released some brake fluid out of here, is go ahead and hit it with some brake clean. Clean up any residual brake fluid that there may have been. What this will do is once this is dried up, it'll let you know if you have any leaks, because then you'll see a wet area. If you have any leaks, go ahead and address them. So now we can install our wheel. Sometimes when I'm having an issue centering or getting the wheel on nice and flat, I like to do a top nice and tight, push in, do a bottom nice and tight, and then rock back and forth till I get those two nice and tight. And that usually helps me get a wheel nice and flat. All right, now we can do the other ones. Come in here with our 19mm. Just snug these up. All right, now to torque these down, we're going to have to put the vehicle on the ground so the wheel doesn't spin. Now that our vehicle's on the ground, we're going to torque our lug nuts down to 80 foot-pounds. We're going to do it in a crisscross pattern. And then sometimes, if you really feel the need to, you can run around a second time just to make sure. And that's it. So now at this point, you're going to want to check your brake fluid level. Make sure that you are between, on this vehicle, the maximum here and the minimum is going to be down here. We're right up here even after bleeding our brakes, so we're perfectly fine. If you were down between these lines, feel free to add to about where we are now. That's a safe zone. If you have to add fluid, to be sure of what fluid you need on this vehicle, you can open your cap and it'll tell you right on the top, .3 or .4 brake fluid.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.